He was 22 years old and he was being sold like a prize steer at the county fair. But this wasn't about a blue ribbon. This was about survival. Boone Carter stood by the grimy window of the dusty chapel, the fabric of his only good shirt scratching at his neck like a hangman's rope. Outside, the wind howled, kicking up dust devils that danced across the barren plains like vengeful spirits. It was a fitting backdrop for the end of his life as he knew it. His future was a ghost, a hollow thing hanging in the corner of the room, mocking him in the shape of a wedding dress he'd never seen the bride wear. It wasn't even for her. It was a relic of a life that was never lived, a symbol for the one he was about to be forced into. The deal had been laid out on a cracked wooden table by the most powerful man in the territory, Sterling Rhodes, a man whose smile was as cold and empty as a banker's heart. Rhodes owned everything, the land, the water, the debts. And Boone's father, a good man with a weakness for bad bets, had left a debt so large it could blot out the sun. "Marry the widow," Rhodes had said, his voice smooth as polished stone. "Marry Cora Maddox and the ranch is saved." It sounded simple. It felt like damnation. Cora Maddox was 30 years his senior, a recluse, a woman the town whispered about but never spoke to. They said her husband had died mysteriously. They said she was strange. They said she was cursed. And now she was to be his wife. The town folk were already sharpening their tongues. They called him desperate, pathetic. Some of the ranch hands at Miller's place, where he'd been sleeping in the barn, had laughed outright. "Got yourself a mother instead of a wife, Boone." They didn't understand the crushing weight of 3 generations of history on his shoulders. The Carter Ranch wasn't just dirt and wood. It was his grandfather's sweat, his mother's garden, his own childhood memories, carved into every fence post. Losing it would be like losing a limb. So he'd nodded. He'd stood there like a coward and sold his own soul to save a piece of land. The church door creaked, a sound like an old bone snapping. Boone turned, expecting the preacher, maybe even Rhodes coming to gloat. But it was her, Cora Maddox. She walked down the aisle alone, and every whisper he'd ever heard about her died in his throat. This was no frail, withered crone. Her hair, shot through with strands of silver, was pulled back in a severe bun, but it couldn't tame the fire in her eyes. They were green, the color of a forest after a storm, and they pinned him to the spot. She wore a simple black dress, the kind a woman wears when she's mourning a life, not starting a new one. She carried herself with a ramrod straight posture, a dignity that made the dusty chapel feel like a cathedral. She stopped 3 feet away from him, and her gaze was so intense it felt like she was peeling back his skin to see the man underneath. When she finally spoke, her voice wasn't the whisper of an old woman. It was clear and steady, like a river running over stone. "You look like a man about to face a firing squad." Boone swallowed, the sound unnaturally loud in the silence. "Wouldn't you?" A flicker of something, not quite a smile, touched her lips. "I've learned that what we want and what we get are rarely the same thing, boy." She stepped closer, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that sent a shiver down his spine. "I know what they're saying about us. I know what you're thinking. But you don't know the first thing about me." The preacher cleared his throat from the altar. In the front pew, Sterling Rhodes sat watching them, a predator enjoying his meal. Boone felt trapped, a fly caught in a web spun by other men's greed. Cora took his arm. Her grip was surprisingly strong. As she led him toward the altar, toward the end of his freedom, he felt a tremor run through her hand. He glanced at her, and for the first time, he saw past the iron mask of her composure. Her hands were shaking just as much as his. And suddenly, Boone Carter realized this wasn't just his execution. It was hers too. The ceremony was a blur. 7 minutes, 420 seconds to bind 2 strangers in a contract written with ink and desperation. When the preacher said, "You may kiss the bride," the words hung in the air like dust motes, thick and suffocating. Boone leaned in, and Cora turned her head just enough so his lips brushed her cheek. It was cold, formal, and yet he caught a scent. Lavender soap, clean and sharp. But underneath it, something else. Something faint and sweet, like the roses his mother used to grow before the drought took everything. It was the scent of a life he thought was lost forever. The moment the preacher closed his Bible, Sterling Rhodes was on them, his shadow falling over them like a shroud. "Congratulations, Mrs. Carter," he said, the name sounding foreign and wrong. His eyes, cold as a winter morning, flicked to Boone. "The deed transfer will be processed tomorrow. Your debt is settled." He leaned in closer, his voice a venomous hiss meant only for Boone. "But remember our agreement. You will be a husband to her in every sense. You will honor this marriage. If you fail, if she complains, I will not only take your ranch, I will salt the earth it stands on." Boone's jaw clenched so hard a tooth ached. "I gave you my word." "Words are cheap, boy," Rhodes sneered, tipping his hat to Cora. "Actions prove character. Ma'am, I believe your husband has a great deal to learn about responsibility." With a final, triumphant smirk, Rhodes was gone, leaving a void in the empty church. The silence stretched between them, a vast, uncharted territory. The wind rattled the windows, a lonely, mournful sound. "My wagon is outside," Cora said, her voice flat. "All business. Or do you have your own arrangements?" Boone felt a flush of shame creep up his neck. "I don't have a place anymore. Lost it months ago. I've been sleeping in Miller's barn." Cora nodded, not a flicker of surprise or pity in her eyes. It was just another fact, another piece on the board. "Then you'll come with me. My house is ours now, I suppose." She walked toward the door, her steps sure and measured, but paused on the threshold. She turned back, and her green eyes seemed to drill right into him. "There are rules," she stated, not asked. "Things you need to understand before you set one foot on my property." He followed her out into the blinding sunlight. A sturdy wagon was hitched to two strong-looking horses. As she climbed onto the driver's seat with a practiced, fluid motion, he saw it. Tucked beneath the bench, within easy reach, was a rifle. Its wooden stock was worn smooth from use, its barrel glinting in the sun. This was not a woman who waited for a man to protect her. "What kind of rules?" he asked, hoisting himself onto the seat beside her. She snapped the reins and the wagon lurched forward, leaving the church and his old life in a cloud of dust. "First rule," she said, her eyes fixed on the road ahead. "I am not your mother, and I am not your maid. You will pull your own weight. You will cook your own meals, wash your own clothes, and clean up your own messes. I am your wife on paper, not your servant in practice." The wagon wheels groaned over the rutted track. "Second rule," she continued, her tone as unyielding as the hard-packed earth beneath them. "My bedroom door stays locked. This is a business arrangement, Mr. Carter. Nothing more. That remains true until I, and only I, decide otherwise." He watched her profile against the endless sky, the hard lines of her jaw, the determined set of her mouth. She was a fortress. "What's the third rule?" Cora was silent for so long he thought she hadn't heard him. The only sounds were the creak of the wagon and the plodding of the horses. When she finally spoke, her voice was a ghost of what it had been, a near whisper that the wind almost stole away. "Don't ever ask me about my first husband." Her head turned and her eyes met his. They were filled with a darkness that had nothing to do with the shadows of the setting sun. Some graves are better left undisturbed. As they crested a small rise, her house came into view. It was a simple cabin, surrounded by a surprisingly well-tended fence. But it wasn't the house that made Boone's breath catch in his chest. It was something else. In the small corral next to the barn stood a single, magnificent black stallion. A horse so fine, so powerful, it looked like it belonged in a general's stable, not a poor widow's yard. A horse like that cost more than most men made in 5 years. And Boone Carter knew that horse. He'd seen it before. He'd seen Sterling Rhodes riding it. The question burned on Boone's tongue, a hot, dangerous coal. He wanted to ask. He needed to ask. But the look on Cora's face as she unhitched the team was a warning, a locked door he didn't have the key for. She moved with an economy of motion, every action precise and purposeful. She was a woman who wasted nothing, not time, not words, not emotions. He swallowed the question and followed her inside, and he stopped dead in the doorway. If the outside was a simple, weathered frontier cabin, the inside was another world entirely. It was a library, a sanctuary. Bookshelves, handmade but sturdy, lined every single wall, filled with leather-bound volumes that looked ancient and well-loved. In the corner, where a simple rocking chair should have been, sat a piano, its dark wood polished to a mirror sheen. This wasn't the home of a simple, uneducated widow. This was the home of a scholar, a lady. Cora saw the shock on his face. Surprised? She asked, a slight, mocking edge to her voice. I didn't expect, he stammered, feeling like a clumsy ox in a china shop. You didn't expect a woman my age, living alone at the edge of nowhere, to have an interest beyond darning socks and baking bread? She finished for him, her tone sharp. I didn't expect anyone out here to have a piano, he said honestly. Her expression softened, just a fraction. My first husband, she said, and the name hung in the air between them, a ghost he was forbidden to acknowledge. Believed education was the only treasure that couldn't be stolen. She moved through the room, lighting oil lamps as the sun finally surrendered to the horizon. The soft glow illuminated a life of quiet refinement that felt utterly alien to Boone. Your room is upstairs, second door on the right. There's a wash basin and fresh linens. He climbed the narrow, creaking stairs, his dusty boots a sacrilege in this quiet, orderly house. The room was small and sparse, but impeccably clean. A simple bed, a dresser, and a window looking out over the back pasture. He sat on the edge of the mattress, the springs groaning in protest, and buried his head in his hands. What had he done? This morning he was just a broke ranch hand. Tonight he was the husband of a mystery, a woman who owned a rich man's horse, more books than the territorial governor, and a past she guarded like a dragon guards its hoard. A sound drifted up from downstairs, a melody, soft, slow, and filled with a profound sadness that seemed to seep into the very walls of the house. Cora was playing the piano. The notes were hesitant at first, then grew in confidence, weaving a tapestry of sorrow and longing. It was the most beautiful, heartbreaking music Boone had ever heard. He found himself creeping to the top of the stairs, listening, mesmerized. The music spoke of loss, of a pain so deep it had no words. It was the sound of her soul, a soul she kept locked away from the world. Then the music stopped, abruptly. The silence that followed was jarring, heavy. Are you planning to spy on me all night, or are you going to come down and eat? Caught. His face burned with embarrassment as he descended the stairs. She was at the kitchen table, having laid out a simple meal of cold beef, fresh bread, and what looked like homemade preserves. A pot of coffee steamed on the stove, its aroma rich and inviting. She didn't look at him as he sat down across from her. You play beautifully, he offered, desperate to fill the silence. I had a good teacher, she replied, her tone a clear dismissal. But Boone, emboldened by the music that had offered him a glimpse behind her walls, pushed. Who taught you? Her fork stopped halfway to her lips. Her knuckles were white where she gripped it. Her eyes, when they met his, were cold as ice. Someone who's been dead for 5 years. The third rule. Don't ask about my first husband. He had broken it on his first night. Before he could apologize, before he could retreat, another sound shattered the quiet. The thunder of approaching horses, fast, urgent. Cora was on her feet in an instant, her body coiled like a snake ready to strike. She blew out the main lamp, plunging the room into shadows, and moved to the window, peering cautiously through a crack in the curtains. Get upstairs, she whispered, her voice tight with a fear that was terrifying to behold in a woman so composed. Now. But it was too late. Heavy boots slammed onto the porch. A fist pounded on the door, the force of it rattling the windows in their frames. It wasn't a knock. It was a demand. Cora Maddox, we know you're in there. The voice was rough, gravelly, with an accent Boone couldn't place. Open this door, or by God, we'll open it for you. Cora's face was a pale mask in the gloom, but her hands were steady. She reached under the kitchen counter and her hand came back with the rifle. With a series of clicks that sounded deafeningly loud, she checked the chamber. She was no stranger to this weapon. There's a back door through the pantry, she hissed, pushing him away from the front of the house. Follow the path behind the chicken coop. It leads to the woods. Get to Miller's place and don't stop. I'm not leaving you, he said, his own fear warring with a sudden, fierce instinct to protect this strange woman who was now his wife. You don't understand. she insisted, her eyes wide with a terror that went beyond a simple robbery. These men, they're not here for money. They're here for me, because of something that happened a long, long time ago. Another thunderous crash against the door made the whole cabin shudder. Please, Boone, go! But he saw the tremor in her hands, the desperation in her eyes, and he couldn't move. He couldn't abandon her. We're married, remember? He said, surprised by the strength in his own voice. For better or worse. That's what the preacher said. He moved to stand beside her, his body shielding hers. What do they want? Before she could answer, the door didn't just open. It exploded. Wood splintered inwards as the frame gave way. 3 men spilled into the room, their long duster coats caked with the grime of hard travel, their faces grim in the flickering lamplight. The leader was a tall, lean man with eyes as dead and cold as a snake's. His gaze swept the room and locked onto Cora. A slow, cruel smile spread across his face, a smile that promised nothing but pain. There she is, he said, his voice dripping with venomous satisfaction. Took us 5 years, but we finally found you. He took a step forward, his smile widening as he looked from her to Boone and back again. Mrs. Thomas Maddox, or should I say, Mrs. Catherine Walsh. The name hung in the air, thick and poisonous. Catherine Walsh. Boone felt Cora, or Catherine, stiffen beside him as if she'd been shot. The rifle in her hands didn't waver, but a new kind of fear, colder and deeper, flashed in her eyes. It wasn't the name of the woman on their marriage certificate. It wasn't the name of the woman buried in the town cemetery next to Thomas Maddox. I don't know who you're talking about, she said, but her voice was a thin, brittle thing. The leader, a man who seemed to enjoy the taste of fear, let out a low chuckle. Oh, I think you do. 5 years, Catherine. 5 long years since you vanished from Philadelphia. Vanished with something that didn't belong to you. His dead eyes finally landed on Boone, dismissing him as nothing more than a piece of furniture. And who's this? Your new watchdog? I'm her husband, Boone said, the words feeling both absurd and absolutely true. The man's eyebrows shot up in genuine surprise, followed by a cruel amusement. Husband? Well, isn't that sweet? Tell me, boy, did she tell you about Philadelphia? Did she tell you about the bank? Did she tell you what she took when she ran for her life? Get out of my house, Cora commanded, the rifle barrel fixed on the man's chest. Our employer is a patient man, but his patience has run out, the man continued, ignoring her threat as he took another casual step forward. His 2 companions fanned out, their hands hovering near the pistols on their hips. He wants his property back, Catherine, the money, and the documents you copied. Boone's mind was reeling. Stolen money, documents, Philadelphia, the cultured woman with her piano and her books. It was all starting to form a picture, but it was a dark and terrifying one. Who was this woman he had bound his life to? She wasn't a simple widow. She was a fugitive. The leader's hand drifted down, slowly, deliberately, to rest on the butt of his own gun. I'm going to give you 10 seconds to decide how this night ends. The easy way, or the way that makes your new husband a widower before his wedding night is even over. The air grew thick, electric. Boone could feel the seconds ticking by like hammer blows against his heart. This was it, a bloody end in a dusty cabin over secrets he didn't even understand. And then Cora did something that defied all logic. She smiled, not the flicker of a smile he'd seen before. This was a full, confident, almost predatory smile. She lowered the rifle just an inch and fired. The explosion was deafening. A chunk of plaster exploded from the ceiling, showering the men in white dust. They flinched back, hands flying to their guns, expecting the next shot to be aimed at them. But it never came. Instead, Cora leaned the rifle against the wall, her movements calm and deliberate. You want to talk about Philadelphia, gentlemen? She said, her voice now smooth as silk, utterly devoid of fear. You want to talk about what I stole? Then let's talk, like civilized people. The leader stared at her, his face a mask of confusion. What kind of game is this, Walsh? No game, she replied, walking to the kitchen table and sitting down, gesturing to the chairs. Just the truth. Boone, she said, her eyes meeting his with a look that commanded trust. Pour our guests some coffee. They've had a long ride. Boone felt like he was moving in a dream. Coffee? For the men who just broke down their door and threatened to kill them? But Cora's gaze was iron. He obeyed, his hands shaking so badly he nearly spilled the entire pot. As he poured, Cora looked the leader dead in the eye. Your employer. It's Marcus Brennan, isn't it? Still furious about his little banking problem. The man's eyes narrowed to slits. Mr. Brennan wants what's his. All $50,000. $50,000. The number was so vast, so astronomical, that Boone almost dropped the coffee pot for real. That was more money than 10 ranches. It was a king's ransom. Cora let out a short, sharp laugh, a sound completely devoid of humor. 50,000? Is that the story he's spinning? How quaint. She took a slow, deliberate sip from her own cup, the picture of calm, while the three armed intruders stood awkwardly in the middle of her kitchen, their entire plan thrown into chaos. Tell me, she continued, setting her cup down with a soft click, when Brennan hired you, did he happen to mention where that $50,000 came from? Did he mention that it belonged to the Dakota Territorial Land Office? Money that was supposed to fund homestead claims for families just like this boy's? The leader's face didn't change, but one of the other men, a younger one with nervous eyes, shifted his weight. You're lying, the leader snarled. Am I? Cora's voice was a blade. Did he tell you why a woman with my education, a woman who can read Latin and play Chopin, would take a job as a simple bank clerk in Philadelphia? It was because my husband, the real Thomas Maddox, was a federal investigator, and he died investigating Marcus Brennan. He died 2 days after he told me he had proof Brennan was laundering federal funds through that bank. Her words hung in the air, heavy and damning. The two henchmen exchanged a nervous glance. This was not the simple recovery mission they'd been sold. I didn't steal a damn thing, Cora said, her voice dropping to a low, intense whisper. I secured evidence. Evidence of federal crimes. Evidence that proves Marcus Brennan has been stealing the American dream out from under the very people this country promised to protect. Evidence, she added, letting the word hang in the air, that has been sitting in a safety deposit box in Denver for 5 years, just waiting for the right person to ask. You're bluffing, the leader said, but the sweat beading on his upper lip told a different story. Cora stood and walked to the bookshelf, her back to the armed men in a display of breathtaking confidence. She pulled out a thick, leather-bound book. It wasn't a novel. It was a journal. This was my husband's, she said, turning back to face them. A copy of his investigation. Names, dates, bank transfers. Even the names of the territorial officials Brennan has in his pocket. She opened it, her finger tracing a line of neat, precise script. June 15th, 1869, she read aloud. Brennan transfers $12,000 in land office funds to a personal account, disguised as consulting fees. Payment authorized by Governor Hartley. Transaction witnessed and notarized by Judge Morrison. One of the henchmen, the nervous one, took an involuntary step forward. Let me see that. Jake, stay put, the leader commanded, but Jake ignored him, moving to look over Cora's shoulder. His face went chalk white. Boss? She's not lying. That's the governor's signature. I've seen it on wanted posters. It's real, Cora said quietly, and there are 40 more pages just like it. Marcus Brennan is a thief on a scale you can't even imagine. The leader raised his pistol, his face a thundercloud of fury and confusion. Enough games. Journal or no journal, we have our orders. Give us what you took. But before he could finish the sentence, a new sound cut through the night. The sound of more horses. Not 2 or 3, a dozen, maybe more, thundering toward the cabin. Through the window, Boone could see the bobbing lights of torches approaching fast. The leader swung his gun toward Cora. Expecting company, were you? Cora stared out the window, and for the first time since the men had arrived, her mask of cool confidence shattered. Her face went ashen, drained of all color. Those aren't my friends, she whispered, her voice trembling. That's him. A man on a magnificent black stallion broke away from the group of riders, galloping ahead. The same black stallion from Cora's corral. It wasn't Sterling Rhodes' horse. It was Marcus Brennan's, and he was here to collect his property himself. The man who entered the shattered doorway didn't look like a monster. He looked like a banker. He was dressed in a fine wool suit that was ridiculously out of place on the frontier. His graying hair was perfectly combed, and his hands were soft and manicured. But his eyes were ancient and cold, the eyes of a predator that had never known a day of hunger or fear. This was Marcus Brennan. He stepped over the debris of the door as if it were a puddle, removing his hat with a gesture of mock politeness. "Catherine," he said, his voice a smooth, cultured baritone that was more menacing than any shout. "You've led me on quite a chase. Rural life seems to disagree with you." His gaze swept over the scene. Cora, defiant and pale. Boone standing protectively beside her. His three hired men, who now looked less like enforcers and more like schoolboys caught by the headmaster. The leader of the trio stepped forward, his bravado gone, replaced by a nervous deference. "Mr. Brennan, we were just handling it." She was about to cooperate. "Were you?" Brennan's voice was silk stretched over a razor's edge. "Or were you listening to her little bedtime stories?" He turned his cold gaze on Cora. "Let me guess. You told them about the federal funds. You showed them Tom's little book of fairy tales?" His casual use of her dead husband's first name was a calculated cruelty, and Boone saw Cora flinch. "That fairy tale has your signature all over it, Marcus," she shot back, "along with Governor Hartley's and Judge Morrison's. It's enough to see you all hang." Brennan actually smiled, a thin, bloodless expression. "Ah, yes, Judge Morrison. Such a tragedy. A sudden heart attack last month. The man was under a great deal of stress." He let the implication hang in the air, heavy and vile. "And Governor Hartley? Let's just say the governor has recently seen the wisdom in my particular brand of economic development. He's become far more agreeable." The room grew 10 degrees colder. This wasn't just a thief. This was a king, and his kingdom was built on graves. The three hired guns were now backing away, their faces pale. They had been sent to strong-arm a runaway thief, not to become accessories in a war against a man who could make judges and governors disappear. "You killed him," Cora whispered, the realization dawning on her face. "You killed Judge Morrison." "I kill no one, Catherine," Brennan said, taking a step closer. "But I am a firm believer in solving problems, permanently." He stopped, his eyes finally settling on Boone, truly seeing him for the first time. He looked Boone up and down with open contempt. "And this is your new problem solver? A boy barely old enough to shave?" Before Boone could react, Brennan's gaze shifted back to his men. "I'm tired of this. Search the house, every inch of it. Find the ledgers and the 50,000. Tear it apart if you have to." But as his men moved to obey, Cora did something that froze them in their tracks. She walked calmly to the oil lamp on the table, picked up a match from the holder beside it, and struck it against the wood. The flame flared to life, bright and defiant in the dim room. Then she picked up her husband's journal and held the lit match just inches from its dry, brittle pages. "One more step," she said, her voice ringing with absolute conviction. "And 5 years of your life's work goes up in smoke, Marcus." Brennan's carefully crafted composure finally cracked. A flash of pure fury crossed his face. "You wouldn't dare. That journal is the only thing keeping you alive." "Is it?" Cora's eyes blazed in the flickering light of the match. "Or is it the one thing stopping you from killing everyone in this room right now and burying us in the yard?" The tiny flame licked closer to her fingers, closer to the edge of the book. The smell of sulfur filled the room. Boone held his breath, watching in awe. She was willing to burn it all down, to destroy her only proof, her only protection, rather than let this man win. This was not the frightened woman from the church. This was a warrior. The match burned down, the flame kissing her fingertips. She didn't even flinch. Just as the flame was about to die, she smiled at Marcus Brennan, a slow, triumphant smile. "Did I forget to mention," she said sweetly, "this isn't the only copy." Brennan's face went slack with shock. What? My husband was a federal investigator, Marcus. He was meticulous. He was paranoid. And he was brilliant. He made 3 copies of everything. She blew out the dying match, the smoke curling up into the tense silence. One is in that safety deposit box in Denver, just like I told your errand boys. Another, she paused, letting the words sink in, was mailed to a certain Thaddeus Stevens, a rather tenacious federal prosecutor in Washington, 6 months ago, with instructions to open it upon the announcement of my death, or my marriage. She looked pointedly at Boone. A marriage, say, to a young man in a small, dusty town, arranged by a man who holds all the local debts, a man like Sterling Rhodes. The pieces slammed together in Boone's mind. Sterling Rhodes, the horse, the arranged marriage. It wasn't just about his father's debt. It was a trap. Rhodes worked for Brennan. The whole marriage was a setup, a way for Brennan to get control of her, to force her hand. His own life, his family's legacy, it had all been just a pawn in a much deadlier game. Brennan stared at her, his face a mask of disbelief and dawning horror. You're bluffing. Am I? Cora walked to the window and pointed out into the darkness. You saw those torches. You assumed they were your men. But you only brought a handful of riders with you from the main road, didn't you? To handle a simple widow. Out in the night, the torches were closer now, resolving into distinct figures on horseback. But they weren't moving like a posse of thugs. They were moving in a disciplined, orderly formation. I sent a letter to Denver yesterday, Cora said, her voice clear and strong, to a U.S. Marshal named Tom Bradley, a good friend of my late husband. I told him about my wedding. I told him if anything at all happened to me or my new husband, he should start by investigating you, Marcus, and your associate, Mr. Rhodes. Brennan spun on his hired men, his face contorted with rage. Kill them! Kill them both now! But it was too late. The leader of the trio looked from Brennan's insane rage to the approaching lawman, then to Cora's calm, steady gaze. He made his choice. We were hired to recover stolen money, Brennan, he said, his voice flat. We didn't sign on to get stretched by the neck for murdering a federal witness. He jerked his head at his 2 companions. We're out. And just like that, they were gone, melting back into the night, abandoning their employer to the fate he had created. Brennan was alone, cornered. He let out a primal scream of fury and drew his own, ornate pistol from his coat. His hand was shaking, his banker's composure utterly shattered. If I'm going to prison, he shrieked, his voice cracking, you're going to hell, Catherine. He raised the gun, aiming it straight at Cora's heart. Boone didn't think. He acted. He threw himself in front of her, a human shield, just as the gun roared. A searing, white-hot pain exploded in Boone's shoulder. The force of the bullet spun him around. A grunt of agony punched from his lungs. His legs buckled. But before he could fall, Cora was there, her strong arms catching him, holding him up. The smell of gunpowder was acrid in the air, mixing with the scent of lavender and old books. Through a haze of pain, he saw the cabin door burst open again. This time, it wasn't thugs or villains. It was men with stars pinned to their chests. U.S. Marshals, drop the weapon, a commanding voice boomed. Marshal Tom Bradley, a tall man with a weathered face and eyes that had seen too much, stood in the doorway, his Colt revolver leveled at Brennan. His deputies fanned out behind him, their own weapons drawn and ready. Marcus Brennan looked at the guns pointed at him, at the ruins of his empire scattered across the floor of a dusty cabin, at the woman he could not break and the boy who had stood in his way. For a fleeting second, Boone saw a flicker of utter despair in the man's eyes. He thought Brennan might surrender. Instead, with a final, pathetic sob of rage, Brennan turned the gun on himself. Before he could pull the trigger, Marshal Bradley moved with lightning speed. The butt of his revolver crashed down on Brennan's wrist. The ornate pistol clattered to the floor. Brennan crumpled, holding his broken hand, his face a mask of pathetic defeat. Marcus Brennan, Marshal Bradley declared, kicking the gun away as his deputies swarmed forward to clap the man in irons. You're under arrest for fraud, conspiracy, and the murder of federal judge Stanley Morrison. As they dragged Brennan out, He shot one last look of pure, undiluted hatred at Cora. She met his gaze without flinching, her expression not of triumph, but of weary, solemn finality. Another man was brought into the cabin in cuffs, struggling between two deputies. It was Sterling Rhodes, his face pale and slack with terror. He had been waiting with the rest of Brennan's men, waiting for the signal that the job was done. He looked at Boone, his eyes pleading. Boone just stared back, the pain in his shoulder a dull throb compared to the sharp sting of betrayal. "Get him out of my sight," Bradley ordered. Then the marshal turned to Cora, and his stern face softened. "Catherine, or Cora, is it now? Are you all right?" "I am now, Tom," she said, her voice thick with emotion, as she helped Boone into a chair. "Thanks to my husband." A deputy who knew something of medicine was already cutting away Boone's shirt, tutting at the wound. "It's clean through. Missed the bone. You're one lucky son of a gun, kid." As the lawmen secured the scene, Marshal Bradley knelt beside the piano. "She told me where to look," he said to Cora, his voice low. "In her last letter. Said if the worst happened, the real proof wasn't in any bank vault." He reached inside the piano, his hand disappearing among the strings and hammers. When he pulled it out, he wasn't holding a journal. He was holding a stack of thin metal plates, engraver's plates, the kind used for printing currency. "My husband realized journals could be burned," Cora explained, her hand resting on Boone's good shoulder. "Paper could be dismissed as forgery, but these are the original plates Brennan used to create the forged land deeds. His fingerprints are likely still on them. It's undeniable proof." Boone stared at the plates, then at the piano. The beautiful, sad music. It had been a lament played over a tomb of secrets. The evidence that could bring down a king had been hidden in the heart of the music all along. The deputy finished bandaging Boone's shoulder, the pain now a manageable, throbbing ache. Cora looked at him, her green eyes shining with a gratitude and a warmth he had never seen before. "You saved my life," she whispered. "You saved mine first," he replied, thinking of the ranch, of the life he had almost lost. He was only just beginning to realize that the debt he owed Sterling Rhodes was nothing compared to the one he now owed this incredible, impossible woman. The woman who was his wife. The sun was rising as the marshals finally led their prisoners away. A new day was dawning, not just on the horizon, but in the small cabin that had become a battlefield. The air no longer felt heavy with secrets, but light with possibility. Cora stood in the doorway, watching the riders disappear into the morning mist. Boone came to stand beside her, his arm in a sling. The shattered door let in the cool morning air. The room was a mess of splintered wood and overturned furniture, but it didn't feel broken. It felt cleansed. "What now?" Boone asked, the question hanging in the quiet space between them. Cora turned from the doorway, and for the first time she gave him a real smile. It wasn't mocking, it wasn't sad, it wasn't defiant. It was genuine, and it transformed her face, erasing years of pain and solitude. "Now," she said, her voice filled with a hope he was just beginning to share. "Now, we rebuild." 3 months later, the sun streamed through a new glass window pane, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. The shattered door had been replaced with one made of sturdy oak, built by Boone's own hands. His shoulder had healed, leaving a puckered scar that served as a permanent reminder of the night his life had irrevocably changed. The house was different. It breathed. Laughter echoed in it more often than silence. Boone had discovered that behind Cora's ironclad composure was a sharp, dry wit, and Cora had discovered that beneath Boone's quiet, stoic exterior was a steady kindness and a strength he didn't even know he possessed. The news from the capital had been swift and decisive. Armed with the engraver's plates and Cora's testimony, the federal prosecutor had dismantled Marcus Brennan's empire of corruption. Brennan was sentenced to life in a federal penitentiary, a fate many considered worse than the gallows. Governor Hartley was impeached, and Sterling Rhodes, in a desperate attempt to save his own skin, had confessed to everything, implicating a dozen other local officials. His testimony earned him a reduced sentence, but his power in the territory was shattered forever. As part of Rhodes' plea deal, all outstanding debts he held were declared null and void. The deed to the Carter Ranch was returned to Boone, free and clear. The $50,000, which was recovered from a hidden safe in Brennan's office, was returned to the Territorial Land Office. True to Cora's word, the first thing it funded was the construction of a new schoolhouse, just a few miles from their cabin. Boone was out by the corral, mending a fence post, when he heard the piano music start. It wasn't the sad, mournful melody he'd heard on his first night. This piece was bright, joyful, and full of life. He smiled, setting down his tools and walking back to the house. He stood in the doorway, watching her play. Her fingers, once so tense, now danced across the keys. She looked up and saw him, the music softening but not stopping. "Any regrets about your arranged marriage, Mr. Carter?" she asked, a playful glint in her green eyes. He thought about it. He thought about the man he had been, scared, cornered, and resentful. He thought about the whispers, the shame, the fear. And then he thought about the woman in front of him, the warrior, the scholar, the survivor, his wife. "Just one," he said, walking over to the piano and leaning against it. "What's that?" "I wish I'd gotten to know Catherine Walsh," he said softly. "She sounds like she was an incredibly brave woman." He reached out, his hand gently touching her cheek. "But I think I'm falling in love with Cora Carter." She stopped playing, her hands resting on the keys. She leaned into his touch, her eyes closing for a moment. "Catherine Walsh fought a war," she whispered. "Cora Carter wants to build a home." Outside the window, the land stretched out before them, no longer a barren prison, but a canvas of endless possibility. They had been two strangers, bound by a villain's contract. But from the ashes of debt and deception, they had forged something real, something true, a partnership, a future. A love story that started with a signature, but would be written in the chapters of the rest of their lives. If you enjoyed this story of justice on the frontier, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more tales of courage and redemption. And let me know in the comments below. What do you think was the biggest twist in Cora's story? Your support helps us keep the campfire burning and the stories coming. Thanks for watching.